today's video, I will show you how to build a weather project using React, Bootstrap, and the OpenWeatherMap API. This is what the final project will look like. You will be able to type in a city name, and once you hit submit, you will now see the hourly forecast for the specific city. And for each hour, you will see the date and time, the current temperature, a description of the weather, and what the actual temperature feels like. If we scroll down, we will see the hourly forecast for the next 5 days in 3-hour increments. So if you notice, this is like 3 o'clock, then 6 o'clock, and so on. And now I will go over the code to explain how I built this, and I will also assume you have a basic understanding of React and Bootstrap. And if you haven't used the OpenWeatherMap API before, I have another video on my channel explaining exactly how it works. Also, I will make sure to upload this full project code to a public Git repo. That way you can download the code and better understand how this project works. Now, switching over to the code, the very first thing I did was add this link tag that imports Bootstrap into our React app. Now we can close the index.html file and just go to the app.js file. Here I created a couple variables using the React useState hook. The first variable is just a weather data variable that will hold all of the data that we get back from the OpenWeatherMap API. The city variable will just store the city that the user inputs into the input box. The loading variable will be used to display a spinner when the data is loading, and the error variable will be used to display an error if we get one back from the OpenWeatherMap API. Next, I have the unit type symbol, which I'll go over later because it will make more sense once I explain how it works with the API. Next, I will explain how the getWeatherData function that I created works. Here you can see we're setting the error weather data to like empty values, and then we're setting the loading variable to true to let the React know that we're currently in a loading state. Then here, we're actually making an API call to the OpenWeatherMap API to get the longitude and latitude of a specific city that the user inputs. And the reason we're doing that is because in this second API call that we're making to get the weather data, we need the latitude and longitude of a specific city. So if I switch back to my browser and go to the OpenWeatherMap API, this is the API that we're using to get the latitude and longitude of the city that the user inputs. If you scroll down a little bit more, you can see this is the exact same API call that we're making in the React code. However, we're specifying a city when making the API call. If we scroll down a little bit more, we can see this is an example of an API response, but the most important thing to focus on is the lat and lon variable that you see here, which represent latitude and longitude. These are the values we want because now we would pass in these values into the next API call to actually get back the weather data for that specific city. So I can actually show the React project making this API call. So if I go back to our React project and open up the network tab and just type in a city, so in this case we'll just do New York again, you can see here that the very first API call that we're making is to the API call I just showed you, and we're passing in the city of New York. And if we look at the response, we can see in the very first one, we get back New York, as well as the latitude and longitude coordinates. If we go back to the React code, you can see here, this is where I'm like parsing out the latitude and longitude values that we get back from the API call. And just to explain a little bit more, once we get back the response and I store inside this response variable, I'm just doing response.data to actually access all of the values that we get back from the API response. And then afterwards, I'm just doing bracket 0 to get the 0th index and get the actual values of the latitude and longitude values that you see here. Once we have the longitude and latitude values of the city that the user inputs, we can then make the next API call to get the actual hourly forecast data for that specific city. Now we can look at the documentation for the API that will return us the actual weather data for that specific city. Here you can see that we give us a 5-day forecast in 3-hour increments. Here is the actual API call to get the weather data. And as you can see here, we just need to pass in the latitude, longitude, and the API key. Also, something I forgot to mention when I was talking about the previous API call is that for every API call with the OpenWeatherMap API, you need to make sure you include a API key just like you see here. And to generate your own API key, it's completely free. You just need to sign up for an account and just generate the API key. And if you're not sure how to do that, I have another video on my channel that shows you step by step on how to generate your own OpenWeatherMap API key. And once you successfully generate your own API key, you can just include it on line 44. Right now, I'm just using one that I created myself. However, when I upload the project, this field will be left blank, so you need to make sure to add your own API key. Going back to the documentation, if we scroll down, we can see what the actual example of an API response looks like. But if we scroll down a little bit further, we can actually get a description for each field, such as the current temperature, what the temperature actually feels like, the sea level, the humidity percentage, and all these other values that you see here. So if we go back to the code, we can see that on line 47, I'm making the API call to actually get back the weather data, and I'm passing in the latitude and longitude values that we got from the previous API call, as well as my API key. And I'm also passing in a query parameter called units. And according to documentation, the units value can either be an empty string, imperial, or metric. If you just passing an empty string, the values will just be returned as Kelvin. If you pass an imperial, the values are returned as Fahrenheit. And if you pass in metric, the values will be returned in Celsius. So if we switch back to my React project, you'll notice that all the values I'm getting back from the API are in Fahrenheit. Also, you might notice that I'm displaying the Fahrenheit symbol after the temperature, and I'm just doing that by using the unit type symbol that I created up here. So all this unit type symbol does is based on the unit type that we're passing to the API, it will then just display the correct temperature unit. So because I'm using the unit type as imperial, if you scroll down to line like 104, you can see I'm just using unit type symbol and I'm passing the unit type to display the Fahrenheit temperature unit. So if we scroll back up to the API, now hopefully this will make more sense of exactly what I'm doing here on line 47. Once I get back that data, I'm then going to access the weather data by just doing the weather data.data and then accessing the list variable that gets returned from the API. And just to visually show you what's going on, if we go back to my React project and look at the network tab, and we can see that this is where I'm making the actual API call by passing in the latitude and longitude value of New York City. If we look at the response, we can see now we get information back on the city, which in this case is New York. But we also see that we get back a list variable that contains all of the hourly weather data for the next 5 days. So all the values inside this list array, I'm now setting inside of this weather data variable that I have here. And this will be used later when we render the data in the actual UI. Then I just have a catch block that will just catch any errors as well as set the error variable that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, I'll just make sure the loading variable gets set to false so that we know to stop displaying the spinner and to display the actual data. Now I'll scroll down to the code for the UI itself. The first thing to notice is the loading variable here. And anytime the loading variable is true, then we'll show the spinner here, which is just a Bootstrap component. And if you haven't used Bootstrap before, it's basically just a UI library that has a bunch of pre-built components. And so in this case, I'm just using the pre-built spinner component to display a loading spinner anytime we're waiting for a response from the OpenWeatherMap API. So I'll switch back to the project and show you. So if we do another city, in this case Atlanta, and hit submit, if you see this loading symbol, it will be displayed anytime we're waiting for a response from the API. Going back to the code, the next thing we can focus on is just what happens when the loading variable is false. It will display all of the code inside this container component. If you have never used Bootstrap before, I would highly recommend just watching a quick video on how the container, row, and column component work with Bootstrap, and then resuming the video once you have a basic understanding of how it works. Here, I just have a container, and inside the container, I just have a row item. But the most important code starts on line 73. Here's the input where the user would type in the city. So this is like the input box here. And then afterwards, I just have a button that when you click on it, it will just call the get weather data function that went over earlier. Here's the error variable that I mentioned earlier that will get set to a value if we get an error back from the API. If this value is true, then I'll just display text that says can't find city. However, if we can't successfully find the city, then I'll just display the title that says weather in whatever the city that the user specified. So I'll go to the project and show you. So right now, if we successfully find a city, it will show weather in Atlanta. But if I type in a random city, then here I'll just display the text that says can't find city. Going back to the code, the next important section of code starts on line 82. And here we're just iterating through all of the data that we got back from the OpenWeatherMap API. So earlier, like I mentioned, we stored all of the data inside this variable called weather data. And if I go back to the project and we look at the network tab, all of the data that I get in this list variable, I'm currently storing in this weather data variable. Then I will use the map function to go through each item in the array and display the corresponding data. Here, I'm using the Bootstrap card component with some of Bootstrap's built-in classes as well, which are like padding, shadow, hiding the border, adding margin, and just rounding the corners of the card component. Then on line 87, I'm displaying the actual date and time for that specific hour of weather data that we get back. Here in the top left, this is the actual date and time that I'm displaying. If we look at the network tab and look for the exact value, which is DT underscore text, and this is the value that I'm accessing and displaying here. This is exactly how I display all the other values I see in the project. For example, for the current weather, if we go back to the code and we look here, I'm just accessing by doing weather data.main.temp. Going back to the network tab, If we look here, we can see that from the list, we just access main, and then from main, we just access the value that's at the temp field here. If you hover over it, you actually see that it tells us how to access this exact value. So even though it shows us that we can access this value by doing list bracket 0.main.temp, list.0 in this case is going to be the equivalent of what we have for the weather data variable. All the other data that I'm displaying back from the OpenWeatherMap API is accessed in the exact same way as the current temperature. Just for one more example, here on line 99, I'm displaying a description of the current weather, which I access by doing weather data.weather bracket 0.description. So if we go back to the network tab and we look here, we can see that there's the weather field here, and here's the 0th index. And if I expand that, I can access the description here, which in this case is going to be broken clouds. If you wanted the value to display something different instead of description, let's say for example, you just wanted to display the main field instead, we can easily change that by going back to the React code, changing description to main, and just hitting save. And now we can see that the updated values are now showing the main value instead of the description value here. One last thing I want to show you is how I displayed the images here. If we go to their documentation, they have a whole page explaining how we can display the weather icon based on the API response that we get back. The most important value is this icon value here. Once we get back the icon value, we can just replace the variable here in this URL. And depending on what value is passed in, then it'll display the corresponding image. Going back to the code, you can see here, this is the URL that I just showed you, and the only variable that I'm replacing is the icon variable, which we get back from the OpenWeatherMap API. And that is the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how to create your own weather project using the OpenWeatherMap API. If you found this video helpful in any way, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe for more content.